The average British household is now sitting on a financial time bomb, and most people haven't even realised it yet. While politicians smile for the cameras and economists throw around optimistic forecasts, the real numbers tell a completely different story, one that should have every working person in this country paying very close attention right now. Because what's happening to the UK economy isn't just about statistics or government budgets. It's about your mortgage payment, your grocery bill, your children's future. And the uncomfortable truth is that we're heading toward an economic reckoning that could reshape life in Britain for an entire generation. The Bank of England keeps inflation at double their target. Interest rates that were supposed to come down are stubbornly high. Wages that are supposed to be growing can't keep pace with the actual cost of living. And household debt? Well, that's reached levels that should terrify anyone who remembers 2008. Yet here we are, with major news outlets focusing on political drama while the foundations of the British economy quietly crack beneath our feet. This isn't doom-mongering or conspiracy theory nonsense. This is what the data actually shows when you strip away the spin and look at what's really happening to ordinary people across the UK. Let me show you exactly what I'm talking about. And if you want to stay ahead of the latest UK economic news and understand what's really going on with your money, hit that like button and subscribe to Economy Reporter right now. Because the information I'm about to share with you won't be found on the evening news. Right now, across Britain, hundreds of thousands of families are experiencing a financial shock that's about to get much worse. The mortgage crisis that everyone thought was easing? It's only just beginning to bite. And the numbers are absolutely staggering when you actually look at them. The average outstanding mortgage debt per household in the UK currently sits at around £136,000. That might not sound catastrophic on its own, but here's where it gets nasty. The average 2-year fixed mortgage rate was sitting at 4.19% in September, and for new borrowers, rates are even higher at 4.52%. That means a typical first-time buyer is now paying over £8,000 in interest alone during their first year. But the real devastation is hitting those coming off their old fixed-rate deals. Imagine this scenario, which is playing out in living rooms across the country every single day. A family locked in a mortgage 5 years ago at 1.8%. Life was manageable. Bills were paid. Maybe there was even money left over for a holiday or two. Fast forward to today, and that same family is remortgaging at over 4%. Their monthly payment has jumped by hundreds of pounds overnight. And there's absolutely nothing they can do about it except find the money somewhere or risk losing their home. The Bank of England has cut rates slightly, moving from 5.25% down to 4%. Politicians celebrated this like some great victory. But for the million-plus households remortgaging this year, it's nowhere near enough relief. The Office for Budget Responsibility projects that average interest rates on the stock of mortgages will peak at 4.7% by 2028. That's more than double what people were paying just a few years ago. And it's going to stay there, crushing household budgets month after month. Repossessions are climbing back toward pre-pandemic levels. Over 1,000 homes were taken into possession in the last quarter of 2024 alone. That works out to 11 properties repossessed every single day across the UK. Behind each of those statistics is a family, real people who worked hard, played by the rules, and still couldn't keep up. Courts are seeing 66 mortgage possession claims filed every day, with 12 possession orders granted daily. These aren't outliers or people who made reckless decisions. These are ordinary British families caught in an affordability crisis that's only getting worse. The government talks about economic stability. The Bank of England insists they're managing inflation. But tell that to someone facing a £600 jump in their monthly mortgage payment while their wages have barely budged. The interest rate trap isn't some abstract economic concept. It's a real mechanism destroying financial security for millions of people, and it's accelerating. Here's something they don't want you to fully understand. When the government announces inflation at 3.8%, that's not the inflation you're actually experiencing, not even close. That official figure is an average, a statistical smoothing that hides what's really happening to the cost of the things you actually need to survive. Food prices, Energy bills, council tax, transport, the essentials that eat up the majority of working people's income, have been rising far faster than any official inflation number suggests. CPI inflation has been stuck at 3.8% for 3 consecutive months now, almost double the Bank of England's 2% target. But walk into any supermarket and ask shoppers if their grocery bill has only gone up by less than 4%. You'll get laughed out of the building. The reality is that food inflation alone has been running at much higher rates. Energy bills, despite government intervention, remain drastically elevated compared to historical norms. And regulated prices, things controlled by government like water rates and council tax, have surged well beyond general inflation. The average annual cost of renting has increased by over £2,500 compared to 3 years ago, the same increase that homeowners have seen in their mortgage repayments. 72% of adults report their cost of living increased in April compared to the month before. And here's the kicker. 14% of those people said they're now using more credit than usual just to cover essentials. Not luxuries, not holidays or new cars, food, heating, basic survival. Think about what that actually means. In one of the world's wealthiest nations, people with jobs and mortgages are going into debt just to eat and keep the lights on. The gap between official inflation figures and lived reality has never been wider. Wages are supposedly growing at 5.9% annually. Sounds good on paper, but when your actual expenses, the ones you can't avoid, are climbing at 10 to 15%, that wage growth is meaningless. You're getting poorer every single month, even if your paycheck looks slightly bigger. Household savings ratios tell the story more honestly. People were holding on to about 4% of their available resources in mid-2022. By mid-2025, that jumped to 11%. Not because people suddenly became more financially disciplined, but because they're terrified. Consumer spending has flatlined since the pandemic. Retail sales volumes haven't grown at all. People aren't spending because they don't have confidence in their economic future. And frankly, they're right not to. The silent theft of inflation isn't just about higher prices. It's about the destruction of purchasing power, the erosion of financial security, the slow suffocation of household budgets that were already stretched thin. And while politicians argue about fiscal rules and central banks tinker with interest rates, ordinary people are making impossible choices between heating their homes and feeding their families. This isn't hyperbole. This is Britain in 2025. The British housing market has become a national scandal, and yet somehow it barely registers as a political priority. The disparity between property prices and wages has reached such absurd levels that the entire concept of home ownership for younger generations is rapidly becoming fantasy. The average UK house price in April stood at £265,000. Reasonable enough in isolation, perhaps? But when you compare that to median incomes, the picture becomes grotesque. Just over 10% of renters aged 20 to 44 can afford to buy a home in the current market. Among single renters in that age group, the figure drops below 3%. Let that sink in for a moment. 97% of single young renters in Britain cannot afford to buy a property. The system isn't just broken, it's completely dysfunctional. And the solution for those who do manage to buy? Over half receive financial help from the so-called Bank of Mum and Dad. If you don't have wealthy parents, you're essentially locked out of home ownership permanently. First-time buyers who do scrape together a deposit face mortgage terms that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. Half of first-time buyer mortgages taken out in 2022 had terms longer than 30 years. A decade earlier, only a quarter had terms that long. People are now committing to mortgage payments until they're in their 60s and 70s, paying hundreds of thousands in interest over the life of the loan. The financial burden is staggering, and it's only getting worse as prices continue to climb faster than incomes. The rental market offers no refuge. Average UK rent now sits at £1,300 per month nationally, but in London it's reached £2,736. That's an 11% increase in London over just 1 year. Renters across the country are paying £106 more per month than they were a year ago, and in the capital, that figure is £220 more each month. Renting now consumes approximately 44% of the average wage, up from 40% just 5 years ago. Nearly half of all available rental homes are now listed at over £1,500 per month, with more than 15% exceeding £3,000. But here's where it gets truly perverse. Landlords are fleeing the market in droves. Around 40,000 former rental properties were listed for sale in the last quarter of 2024, but only about 3,600 were let again in the first quarter of 2025. An estimated 18,000 homes are disappearing from rental stock. The supply of new rental listings has fallen 22% below pre-pandemic levels. Total properties available to rent across the UK now sits at a historic low, so demand is crushing, supply is vanishing, and rents are skyrocketing as a direct result. The government promises to build 1.5 million homes by 2029. Even if they achieve that, which history suggests is highly unlikely, it won't come close to addressing the backlog. Over 1.3 million households are currently on waiting lists for social housing in England alone. That includes 336,000 households in London. There are 123,000 households in temporary accommodation, costing the government approximately £2 billion annually. The scale of the crisis is breathtaking, and nothing being done comes even remotely close to solving it. Young people look at this landscape and see no future, no possibility of building wealth through property ownership, no stability in an increasingly hostile rental market, no path to the kind of middle-class life their parents and grandparents took for granted. The housing market isn't just a time bomb. It's a generational betrayal that's reshaping British society in fundamental ways, and the fuse is burning faster than anyone wants to admit. The government loves to tout strong employment numbers, low unemployment, job creation, economic resilience. But peel back the surface layer of those statistics and you'll find something far less reassuring. The UK labour market is fundamentally weaker than official numbers suggest, and the quality of employment available to British workers has deteriorated dramatically over the past decade. Unemployment currently sits at 4.8%, with about 1.74 million people unemployed. That's up nearly 300,000 from the year before. Not exactly the sign of a thriving jobs market. But the real story isn't in the unemployment rate. It's in what kinds of jobs people are actually doing and how much they're really earning. Zero-hour contracts, gig economy exploitation, and underemployment have become standard features of the British labour market. People counted as employed, but working far fewer hours than they want or need. Others trapped in precarious work arrangements with no job security, no sick pay, and no pension contributions. Productivity has been falling, not rising. It decreased by 0.6% in the second quarter of 2025 compared to the previous quarter. Compared to the year before, productivity was down 0.8%. This is catastrophic for long-term economic prospects. A productive workforce earns more, generates more tax revenue, and supports higher living standards. A stagnating or declining productivity rate means wages can't grow sustainably, public services can't be properly funded, and economic growth remains permanently stunted. Real wage growth versus cost of living tells the brutal truth. Yes, wages are nominally growing at 5.9%. But when inflation sits at 3.8% officially and closer to double digits for essentials, that wage growth evaporates. Workers are running faster just to stay in the same place. And for millions, they're actually falling behind despite working longer hours. The employee to underemployment pipeline has become a defining feature of modern Britain. Graduates with degrees working in coffee shops, qualified professionals cobbling together multiple part-time jobs just to pay rent, skilled workers forced into the gig economy because stable employment has vanished from entire sectors. Youth unemployment deserves special attention because it represents a catastrophic waste of human potential. Young people leaving education to find there are no meaningful job opportunities. Those who do find work often end up in dead-end positions with no training, no advancement prospects, and wages that don't cover basic living costs. The psychological and economic damage of this situation will reverberate for decades. A generation that can't establish financial independence, can't afford housing, and can't plan for the future isn't just an economic problem. It's a social crisis waiting to explode. Business confidence has been falling for 5 consecutive quarters. It now stands at its weakest level since the fourth quarter of 2022. When businesses lack confidence, they don't invest, they don't hire, they don't expand. The knock-on effects ripple through the entire economy. Fewer opportunities for workers, less innovation, stagnant productivity. The employment numbers the government celebrates mask a labour market that's fundamentally broken and getting worse. Chancellor Rachel Reeves faces what economists are calling a trilemma: how to pay for spending plans, keep promises not to raise taxes on working people, and still stick to her own borrowing rules. Spoiler alert, she can't. The numbers simply don't add up. Government borrowing in the first 6 months of the 2025 to 2026 financial year hit £100 billion. That's £12 billion more than the same period the previous year. Public sector net debt now equals 95.3% of GDP, up from 94.3% a year before. The fiscal outlook is dire. The estimated fiscal shortfall sits somewhere between £25 and £30 billion. To address that gap while meeting her fiscal rules would require either massive spending cuts or substantial tax increases. Probably both. But the government has boxed itself in with political promises that make either option politically toxic. So instead, we get hints, leaks, and carefully worded warnings about tough decisions ahead. Translation: tax rises are coming, but they'll try to disguise them or claim they're not breaking promises through clever accounting tricks. The tax burden in Britain is already at a 70-year high. People are paying more in tax than at any point since the 1950s, yet public services are crumbling. The NHS has record waiting lists, schools are falling apart, local councils are going bankrupt, infrastructure is decaying. Where is all that money going? Debt servicing costs have exploded due to higher interest rates. Pensions and benefits eat enormous chunks of the budget. Government inefficiency and waste persist across departments. But the uncomfortable truth is that decades of underinvestment and mismanagement have created a situation where even record taxation can't fund basic services adequately. Business investment growth forecasts keep getting revised. First, it was 1.2%, then upgraded to 3.7% for 2025. But for 2026, it's expected to flatten to 0% due to global trade disruption and tightening fiscal policy. When businesses don't invest, productivity doesn't improve. When productivity doesn't improve, wages can't rise sustainably. It's a vicious cycle, and the government's policy paralysis is making it worse. Political leadership has been utterly absent on long-term economic reform. Both major parties are terrified of alienating voters with hard truths. So instead, they offer magical thinking. We can have better public services without raising taxes on ordinary people. We can solve the housing crisis without upsetting homeowners who benefit from rising prices. We can boost growth without making difficult structural changes to how the economy functions. None of it is true. None of it is possible. And everyone with even basic economic literacy knows it. The recent budget announcement will include revenue-raising measures and spending cuts. Everyone knows it's coming. The question is how severe it will be and who will bear the brunt of the pain. History suggests it won't be the wealthy. Capital gains tax might increase to 30%, which would primarily affect those with substantial investment portfolios. But the real burden will likely fall on workers through stealth taxes, frozen thresholds, and cuts to public services they rely on. The government's non-response is actually a calculated political strategy. Do the bare minimum to avoid immediate crisis while hoping anything changes to make the problems go away. It won't work. The structural issues are too deep, the fiscal challenges too severe, and the political will to make genuinely transformative changes simply doesn't exist. So we'll muddle through, getting gradually poorer, while those in power pretend everything is under control. The International Monetary Fund upgraded its growth forecast for the UK, but immediately followed that with warnings about potential impacts of global trade disruptions. Translation: we think you might avoid immediate disaster, but you're incredibly vulnerable to external shocks. The Bank of England slashed its growth forecast for 2025 from 1.5% to 0.75%. That's not a minor revision. That's a recognition that the economy is barely growing at all. GDP growth projections show the UK might achieve around 1.4% growth for the year as a whole. That would place Britain second in the G7 for annual growth. Sounds impressive until you realise we're comparing ourselves to other struggling economies in a low-growth environment. It's like being the tallest person in a room full of children. The achievement is less impressive than it initially appears. And even that modest growth is heavily dependent on public spending, which is unsustainable given the fiscal situation. The National Institute of Economic and Social Research expects there will be roughly a £40 billion current budget deficit in 2029 to 30. Their forecast hasn't changed despite slight improvements in some areas. That tells you everything about how structural the fiscal problems are. No amount of tinkering around the edges will fix a £40 billion hole. The British Chambers of Commerce revised growth expectations to 1.3% for 2025. They also highlighted that inflation is expected to peak at 3.7% this year before falling back in 2026 and 2027. But here's what the experts are saying privately, away from official forecasts and public statements. The UK economy is stuck in a low-growth trap with no clear path out. Productivity growth remains abysmal. Business investment is weak. Political uncertainty weighs heavily on economic decision-making. The combination of fragile global supply chains, heightened geopolitical tensions, and persistent inflationary pressures leaves Britain exposed to volatility that could derail growth at any moment. The property market is described by some analysts as a slow-motion housing crash. Prices aren't collapsing overnight, but they're slowly deflating in real terms while becoming even more unaffordable relative to incomes. The financial system remains vulnerable to shocks despite post-2008 reforms. Shadow banking now accounts for about half of all lending, creating systemic risks that regulators struggle to monitor or control. If another crisis hits, the interconnectedness of big tech, hedge funds, private equity, and traditional banks could trigger contagion that makes 2008 look minor by comparison. Economists at the Institute for Fiscal Studies point out that by the end of 2026, they expect growth to be on trend, inflation to be at target, interest rates to be at their neutral rate, and unemployment to be at its natural rate, absent any other shocks. That's a massive caveat, because shocks are almost guaranteed. Whether it's a trade war, geopolitical conflict, pandemic, or financial crisis, something unexpected will happen. And when it does, Britain's economic fragility will be brutally exposed. The consensus among serious analysts is that we're one major shock away from recession. Growth is too weak, debt is too high, productivity is too low, the fiscal position is too precarious, political leadership is too absent. Everything is held together by hope and willful ignorance of underlying vulnerabilities. That's not a foundation for sustainable prosperity. It's a recipe for eventual crisis. Britain doesn't exist in a vacuum. What happens in the United States, Europe, and major emerging markets directly impacts the UK economy, whether we like it or not. And right now, the global economic picture is concerning. US economic policy under recent administrations has created enormous uncertainty. Tariff threats and trade disruptions affect British exporters and global supply chains that UK businesses depend on. When America sneezes, Britain catches a cold. That old saying has never been more relevant. European economic troubles spill over across the Channel regardless of Brexit. The Eurozone is struggling with its own growth challenges, energy crisis fallout, and political fragmentation. Germany, the economic engine of Europe, is sputtering. France faces fiscal problems and social unrest. Italy's debt situation remains precarious. When our closest trading partners struggle economically, British exports suffer. Tourism declines. Investment flows dry up. The ripple effects touch every sector of the UK economy. Trade issues post-Brexit continue to create friction and additional costs for businesses. The promised benefits haven't materialised. The predicted worst-case scenarios haven't fully played out either. Instead, we've settled into a new normal of higher costs, more paperwork, and reduced market access that makes British businesses less competitive. Export growth is forecast to remain modest, picking up to 3.1% in 2025 but facing ongoing global uncertainties and persistent trade frictions. Currency weakness is another major concern. The pound has been losing value against major currencies. That makes imports more expensive, feeding directly into inflation for British consumers. Everything from food to electronics to fuel costs more when your currency is weak. And while a weak pound theoretically helps exporters, the reality is more complex. Many British businesses rely on imported components and materials. Currency weakness increases their costs, squeezing profit margins and limiting their ability to price competitively. Global trade policies have become increasingly unpredictable. What was once a relatively stable rules-based international trading system has fragmented into competing blocs, tariff threats, and bilateral negotiations. Britain, outside the EU but lacking the economic heft of the US or China, finds itself squeezed in the middle, too small to dictate terms, too exposed to ignore global shifts. The trade deficit of £9.2 billion in the 3 months to August, up from £8.6 billion in the previous quarter, illustrates how Britain consumes more from the world than it sells. The current account deficit reached £28.9 billion in the second quarter of 2025. That's 3.8% of GDP, up from 2.8% the previous quarter. This matters because it shows Britain is relying on foreign capital inflows to fund its consumption. When global investors lose confidence or shift their money elsewhere, countries with large current account deficits get hammered. Their currencies collapse, interest rates spike, economic crisis follows. Britain isn't immune to those dynamics just because we're a developed economy. Geopolitical tensions add another layer of risk: conflict in Ukraine and the Middle East, rising tensions between the US and China, energy supply disruptions, refugee crises. All of these create economic shockwaves that Britain cannot avoid. We're a globally integrated economy, whether that's comfortable or not. And right now, the global context is fragile, unpredictable, and tilting toward greater instability. Britain's economic vulnerabilities are magnified by this international environment. Forget the macro statistics for a moment. Let's talk about what this economic situation actually means for your life. If you're a homeowner with a mortgage, you're facing years of higher repayments. If you locked in a cheap fixed rate before interest rates rose, you're living on borrowed time. When that deal ends, your payment will jump by hundreds of pounds per month. If you're already on a variable rate or recently remortgaged, you're feeling the pain right now. Either way, that money has to come from somewhere. Less for savings, less for your kids, less for any kind of financial security or future planning. If you're renting, you're trapped in an increasingly hostile market. Rents rising faster than wages, supply vanishing as landlords exit, competition for every property intensifying. You're one rent increase away from being priced out of your area, one unexpected cost away from falling behind on payments. The stress is constant, the insecurity is exhausting. And there's no path to homeownership for the vast majority of renters, no matter how hard they work or how much they save. The game is rigged, and you're losing. For younger people, the implications are even more devastating. You're entering a labour market offering precarious work, low wages, and no job security. You're facing housing costs that consume half your income or more. You're looking at a future where owning a home is fantasy, where building wealth is impossible, where starting a family seems financially irresponsible. The life trajectory your parents' generation took for granted, education, stable job, house, family, retirement, has been completely dismantled. And nobody in power seems to care or even acknowledge it's happening. Retirement savings are under threat for everyone. Pension funds took hits when markets tumbled. Defined contribution schemes won't deliver the retirement income people were promised. Those planning to retire in the next few years might find they can't afford to. They'll need to work longer or accept a drastically reduced standard of living. The contract between workers and society, you work hard and save, will ensure you can retire with dignity, has been broken, and it's not being replaced with anything better. Middle-class squeeze is real and accelerating. Professional jobs that once guaranteed comfortable middle-class life now barely cover essentials in many parts of the country. The gap between the wealthy and everyone else yawns wider every year. Upward mobility has stalled. Social stratification is hardening. Britain is becoming a more divided, more unequal society. And economic stress is the primary driver of that division. When people can't meet basic needs despite working full-time, something is fundamentally wrong with how the economy is structured. The mental health impact of economic insecurity cannot be overstated. Constant financial stress destroys well-being. Relationships suffer. Physical health deteriorates. People feel trapped, hopeless, angry. That psychological toll ripples through families and communities. It manifests in political extremism, social breakdown, and collective trauma that will take generations to heal. The economic crisis isn't just about money. It's about the erosion of human dignity and the destruction of social cohesion. Survival strategies people are adopting tell you everything about how dire things have become. Skipping meals to save money, turning off heating in winter, taking on multiple jobs, going into debt for basic necessities, relying on food banks, moving in with parents well into adulthood. None of this should be necessary in one of the world's richest countries. Yet here we are, and it's getting worse, not better. So what needs to change? What's the actual path out of this mess? The solutions exist. Economists know what works, but implementing them would require political courage that's completely absent from British politics right now. Housing policy needs radical reform, massive public investment in social housing, serious regulation of the private rental sector, including rent controls, land value taxation to discourage speculation, planning reform that prioritises housing over NIMBYism. None of this will happen because homeowners vote and they benefit from high prices. Tax reform must address inequality and generate revenue for public services. Higher taxes on wealth, property, and capital gains. Closing loopholes that benefit the rich. Ensuring corporations pay their fair share. Investing that revenue in infrastructure, education, healthcare, and public services that improve productivity and quality of life. This won't happen because the wealthy have captured politics and media, ensuring any such proposals are immediately demonized as class warfare. Banking and financial system reform remains urgent. Separate retail banking from speculation. Regulate shadow banking properly. Create public banking infrastructure so payments don't depend on private institutions. Ensure the financial sector serves the real economy rather than extracting wealth from it. These reforms were promised after 2008. They never happened. The same vulnerabilities remain, and we'll pay the price again when the next crisis hits. Industrial strategy and productivity growth require long-term thinking and public investment. Training and education systems that match workforce skills to economic needs. Research and development funding. Support for emerging industries. Infrastructure investment in transport, energy, and digital connectivity. All of this takes years to bear fruit. Politicians operating on election cycles have no incentive to pursue it, so we continue to underinvest and wonder why productivity stagnates. Social safety net strengthening is essential for both human dignity and economic resilience. Universal basic services that ensure everyone has access to housing, healthcare, education, and nutrition regardless of income. Unemployment benefits that actually allow people to live while finding work. Support systems that prevent economic shocks from destroying lives. This requires a fundamental rethinking of the social contract, and no major political party is willing to have that conversation. Political reform might be the most important and most impossible change needed. Get money out of politics. Break the stranglehold of wealthy interests over policy. Create a system where politicians are actually accountable to voters rather than donors. Institute long-term economic planning that transcends election cycles. Develop serious technocratic capacity in government. None of this will happen through the existing system, because the system is designed to prevent exactly these changes. The alternative to reform is continued decline, gradually getting poorer, more divided, more insecure, more dysfunctional. At some point, the pressure becomes unbearable and something breaks, either through political upheaval, economic collapse, or social breakdown. History shows that countries which refuse to address fundamental problems don't just muddle along indefinitely. Eventually, reality reasserts itself, and the longer you postpone dealing with structural issues, the more painful the inevitable reckoning becomes. The UK economy in 2025 is a slow-motion disaster. Not dramatic enough to make headlines every day, not severe enough to force immediate action, but grinding, relentless, destructive, eroding living standards, destroying social cohesion, and stealing futures from an entire generation. The numbers don't lie. Growth barely positive, productivity falling, inflation stubbornly high, debt at record levels, housing unaffordable, public services crumbling, tax burden at 70-year highs, business confidence collapsing. None of this is secret. None of this is conspiracy. It's all there in official statistics for anyone willing to look. What makes it worse is that solutions exist. Other countries have addressed these problems. We know what works. Higher taxes on wealth, massive social housing investment, proper regulation of finance, industrial strategy, strong social safety nets, political reform. But implementing solutions requires admitting there's a problem. It requires political courage to tell voters uncomfortable truths. It requires confronting powerful interests who benefit from the current dysfunction. And nothing in British politics suggests any of that is forthcoming. So we're left watching the slow unravelling, pretending it's not happening, blaming immigrants or benefit claimants or the EU or whoever this week's scapegoat is. Anything to avoid confronting the reality that our economic model is broken and our political system is incapable of fixing it. The question isn't whether things will change. They will. Economic reality always wins eventually. The question is whether change happens through deliberate reform that protects people or through crisis that destroys lives. But now, all you can do is understand what's actually happening. Don't believe the spin. Don't trust the official reassurances. Look at your own financial situation, your mortgage payment, your rent, your grocery bills, your prospects for the future. That's the real economy. And if what you're experiencing doesn't match what politicians and economists are saying, trust your own reality, because they're either lying or they're so disconnected from normal life that they genuinely don't understand what's happening to ordinary people. The UK economy is quietly unravelling. Your financial security is under threat. Your children's future is being stolen, and nobody in power is going to save you. The only question is what you're going to do with that information. Stay informed. Subscribe to Economy Reporter for the latest UK economic news that actually matters. Hit that like button if this video opened your eyes to what's really happening. And start making decisions for your family based on reality, not the fairy tales politicians are selling. Because the storm is here, and it's only going to get worse before it gets better.